Today on Computer Tech and More, we're going to be taking a look at the Storm T3 140mm fan, as well as the Corsair AF140 Elite. Let's get right into the data and check out those graphs. Alright, so here we are in some basic information for the Storm T3 140 and the Corsair AF140 Elite fans. The Storm T3 is a 30mm fan, so it's got a little bit of extra thickness to it, which should help with blade angle to produce a better static pressure. As for the Elite, it's basically more like a standard 140mm fan. Bearing types, the Storm uses an FDB bearing, while the Elite uses a fluid dynamic bearing. Both are 12 volts, power very similar in that amperage. RPM range for the Storm is 600 to 1,500, and for the Elite it's 400 to 1,600, so fairly similar RPM ranges. As for the airflow in CFM, cubic feet per minute, the Storm can produce, by their ratings, 112.7 CFM, while the Elite produces 84.5 static pressure. The Storm produces 2.29, and the Elite 1.73. And the decibel ratings down below, and mean time between failure at the bottom. From the information I could find, I couldn't find it for the Elite when I went looking for it. So let's move on to the graphs. Alright, this first graph is my case airflow test simulation. The simulation has 4 data points: 6 inches, 9 inches, 11 inches, and 14.5 inches. 6 inches represents a small form factor case. What you'd use in very small form factor cases, like a media center PC. 9 inches represents a small case, but more like a real tower. 11 inches represents a mid-tower, kind of like the Corsair 550D, that's an older one, or maybe a Meshify C, Meshify 2, that one from Fractal Design. And a 14.5 represents a case a lot like the Fractal Design Torrent. And this is the distance between the front from the fan to where I estimate the front fan of the AirCooler would be. So this information would be used to determine how much air the fan is able to push to get to your AirCooler. What we're looking for in this data is for the line to be as flat as possible. That represents that the air speed from front to back has dropped as little as possible, which is ideal. Short of that, we want the line to be as linear as possible. We don't want the line to steeply drop off in a parabolic type curve. And looking at the scope of this data from basically beginning to end represents how much the fan kind of dissipates the air. So a very focused fan, so one that creates more like a column of air that is pushing through the back, is going to maintain a higher air velocity from front to back over the course of a distance because it's got a focused airflow, while one that kind of spews air in every direction won't have that, and you'll see a much faster drop off in air velocity. So taking a quick look at the AF140 Elite, we can see that it has a very steep drop off in air velocity from beginning from the front to the back. Jumping over to the Antec Storm T3, we can see that its drop off is fairly steep, but it kind of looks like it tends to level out towards the end fairly differently than the Corsair, which I just jumped back and forth to. But overall, I'd still say it has a very steep drop off for a 140mm fan. But all this is taken in a vacuum. How does it compare against my control? So my control fan, represented in this green line, well, aqua, not quite aqua, darker green blue line, is based primarily like 80% off of the Noctua NF A12X25 with a little bit mixed in of the Noctua A14. Two fans that I found to be fairly good and fairly representative of basically a good fan. So it won't have the same sort of peaks that I saw in the A12, but it has a better kind of ending than the A12X25, more like the A14. So what we'd be looking for is a fan that outperforms it. And while we can quickly see that in noise normalized testing, the Storm starts off with better performance. It has a higher air velocity at that 6-inch mark, but then it quickly drops kind of way below the other two fans. And then the Corsair starts off under. It actually ends up beating the Storm, and then it quickly drops off even lower than the Storm. So what I'm seeing from this is that neither of these two fans really creates a focused airflow, and they tend to lose a lot of air velocity, more like a 120 millimeter fan, where this behavior of dropping off almost to zero at the end of my case simulation tends to happen more often, while most 140 millimeter fans tends to maintain air velocity. Moving on to 100% PWM. So this is where the fans are allowed to go full speed. The key on the side here, so again, red is the Corsair and the blue line represents the Antec Storm, the RPM rate, the RPMs that they achieved, and the noise level is the last number. So the Corsair Elite is noisier than the Storm, but it is moving more air than the Storm as well. The Storm starts off kind of better, but quickly drops. The Elite kind of maintains itself a little bit better, but both of them are below my control fan. So I'd say that case airflow is not an ideal situation for these fans, unless you're looking at them primarily in a small form factor case where they perform fairly well. Moving on to two graphs, one page, and we have RPM versus airspeed through my CPU cooler, and we have noise versus airspeed through my same CPU cooler. So you can look at this data to represent a pressure situation, so where the fan needs to produce more pressure for better performance. So this is a good representation for, again, a small form factor case where you tend to need a little bit more pressure optimized fans to push air through every nook and cranny because they can be very tight and small, or pushing air through your CPU cooler, or a radiator in liquid cooling loops. In these graphs, the Corsair AF is represented by the blue line, the Storm is represented by the green line, and my control is a red line. So in these graphs, over here in the bottom right is bad performance, in the top left is very good performance, and that's true on basically all the other graphs except for pure airflow reading type ones. So quickly, what are we seeing on this? For blade efficiency, this is how good essentially the blade performance is on the fan itself, not how good it is on a noise profile. We can see that the control is right there, and both fans are outperforming my control through my CPU cooler. So they're indicating good performance, with the Storm being slightly better. As for noise profiles, with the second graph on this page, we can see that the Storm, again, is outperforming both these two fans, and the Corsair being a bit worse than my control fan in a noise situation. Looking at the data from another point of view, so this is raw CFM, cubic feet per minute, so it's run through a tube, so you won't see as much variation in performance data when it's run through a tube because it basically focuses the airflow for you. So that's why I think it's important to take a look at a case simulation, take a look at it in a pressure situation, and then take a look at CFM to see how it coordinates to the brand's actual rating of the fan. So we have RPM versus CFM, and we have noise versus CFM. Same color markings, and we can see that the Storm is a very good performing fan, with the AF Elite performing right along my control line. As for noise values, the Storm is again outperforming my control and the Corsair Elite. But in this situation, the Corsair Elite is outperforming my control fan. I think I forgot to mention CFM, RPM, CFM, decibels. Corsair AF140 Elite. Antec Storm T3. Now let's take a step back and take a look at how these fans can compare against a bunch of other fans that I've taken a look at. So this is primarily with 140mm fans. I have a couple 120s that performed really well just as comparison points, but it's going to be primarily data from the 140mm class fan. We have the fan name and the RPM that it was spinning for my standard noise normalized value of 40 decibels by my readings. It's not true 40 decibels because I don't have a quiet chamber. So I'm basically taking out whatever the noise volume is in my room. I just place the fan really close to the fan so that it basically picks up as little of everything else as possible. So it's not true 40 decibels. 40 decibels is the rating from my Noctua NF-A12X25. It's RPM of 1,100 that I found to be particularly silent, where I just barely could hear it. So I used that as my standard reading point, and I just derived, like took it backwards, the decimal point, chose that as the reading. So these fans would be near silent at this airflow and at this RPM. So now that that disclaimer is out of the way, the Antec Storm T3 is a very high performing fan. It produced 1.5 meters per second of airflow. I forgot to mention at the bottom of this graph, you'll see these numbers. This is derived from my CPU cooler test called like max airflow or something like that, or max cooling. And I recommend checking out that video if you're curious about my CPU cooler and that sort of testing methodology. But in the end, what it represents is I got backwards calculated what airspeed produces, allows or cools my CPU to what wattages, letting my CPU just run unlocked, the only limitation being wattage. So with 0.5 meters per second of airflow, the CPU will run at 130 watts. At about 1.5 meters per second of airflow, it'll run at 210 watts. So what does this mean for your choice in picking up a fan? Well, if you don't have the same cooler as me, those wattages don't mean anything. But what it does mean is that let's say you have a Arctic P14 on your cooler. Well, at this noise normalized value, if you were to upgrade to the SilentWings 4 Pro or the Antec T3, you would see an instant improvement in performance, whether it be CPU temperature or the maximum power draw or something along those lines. Or you could run the fan a little bit slower and have a little bit lower noise values even. So basically it's saying that you can get more performance out of certain fans if you are other ones. But if you're already using like the Storm T3, then you've got pretty much nowhere to improve. That's how you can use this data for yourself. Going back to here, this is the Corsair Elite, and it's producing 1.1 meters per second of airflow. It's not a bad result. It's more middle of the pack. It's towards the top, but not at the very top end. But definitely a good contender for a CPU cooler. It is outperforming the Noctua A14, which is used in partial for my control fan. And this would also be a great time for me to note the error in my calculation, in my testing. not calculations. My anemometer, so that's the wind speed gauge, has an accuracy of plus or minus 0.1 meters per second. So fans that are within 0.1 meters per second are functionally equivalent. And as for noise values, my readings with my microphone are approximately plus or minus 3 decibels. So fans that are within 3 decibels and within that 1 meter, 0.1 meter per second, you could consider to be functionally equivalent just because of the error that I'm able to produce right now, which I hope to be able to improve on thanks to supporters like you and subscribing to this channel. Anyways, let's move on and check out these fans at 100% PWM and how these fans sort of shake up in their new ratings. So the Noctua F12, it is a 120 millimeter fan, but it's spinning at 3000 RPM and it's rip-roaring loud at almost 70 decibels. But you move a lot of air. And my CPU has a maximum, I think that's an error, that should be 250 watts, has a maximum wattage of about 250. So if you need the maximum amount of cooling for your CPU, you want to be looking at these really high airflow fans. So RPM, so fan name, RPM, and its noise level is the last line. Their top performers are the Silentwings 4 Pros, the 141, 2.2 meters per second. We continue to move down. Here's the Corsair AF140 Elite at 53 decibels, moving 1.9 meters per second of air. So it's a pretty good result, but not quite at the top end. It's not bad, but it's not utterly fantastic. Its noise level is pretty good, but for the same noise level and the 140 millimeter class, none are really there. The 120s tend to do a little bit better. Moving to the Storm T3 right here, this purple line, we can see that it's moving 1.8 meters per second of air at 44 decibels. So it's quite a lot quieter for only 0.1 meter per second airflow less. But 0.1 meters per second does equate to several watts of cooling. Taking a look at the data from another perspective, so this is decibel ratings along the bottom and air speed, and this will be how much performance per decibel you're getting at basically every data point. So the orange line represents the Antec Storm T3. It's towards the top of the graph, performing very well overall, all things considered. And the Corsair Elite is down here, more in the middle of the pack. So it's not a bad place for it to be, but it's just not as high a performer. One thing to note is they both end up in close to the same spot, despite the Corsair Elite producing more noise. So as a fan goes this way, they produce more noise. As the fan goes this way, they produce less noise for that given air speed. So you want the fans to be as high in this direction as possible. Jumping back to my case simulation test. So this is noise normalized distance from the fan versus airspeed. The bottom is distance, the top is, or the vertical is airspeed. The highlighted orange is the Antec Storm T3. We can see that at the 6-inch mark, it has really high performance, being actually the top fan. But it quickly drops in performance. Mind, I don't have data points in there. But it's indicative of how quickly it drops in performance, to be basically at the bottom of the graph. And then it kind of levels out, joins the rest of them, still at the bottom, and then drops again, ending up basically right at the bottom of the graph. The Corsair Elite, on the other hand, starts off basically in the middle of the pack and then drops all the way to the very bottom, indicating neither of these two fans are very good in case airflow applications. While technically not as good, the Silentwings 4 Pro 120 has much better performance in this category. This light blue line, I'm trying to point right here, is the Noctua NFA14, and it's performing much, much better. it is basically holding a very flat line. It doesn't have the same top end in a 6-inch case, but it performs very well, and actually right at the end, at that 14.5-inch mark, it ends up being one of the top performers. The only fans beating it out are like the Silent Wings 4 Pro 140mm fan over here. Taking a look at these fans at 100% PWM, we can see that the Noctua A14 is spinning at 3000 RPM and is pretty loud at 64.5 decibels, but it is our top performer right here because it is just spinning so much faster than the other fans and pushing so much more air. So you need to take all this with a grain of salt. It has the RPM and the decibel reading over in the corner. So the Storm T3 spinning at 1530 RPM, 44 decibels, is sitting kind of middle bottom, and it drops to the bottom. The Corsair is again basically at the bottom. So how do they compare to other fans with similar RPMs? Well, the Unifan SL140 is spinning slower and has functionally similar performance. Actually, it has kind of better. It doesn't drop off as much, but it doesn't have the same sort of top ends. Antec P14 is this line, and it's performing quite a bit better. It doesn't have the same sort of drop off as these fans. So I would, again, you shouldn't be running your case fans at 100% RPM. It means that something is dramatically overheating inside your computer. But looking at the data, these fans I would not recommend, period, end of story, as case fans. The Storm T3, because it's so close to the front, so it doesn't have much time for the air to dissipate in every direction, is our top performer here, especially when you're taking a look at noise profiles. But again, this is that close-up mark. As for the Corsair, it is right here, functionally in the middle of the pack. But as we saw from other data points, I really wouldn't recommend these unless you're specifically looking at small form factor cases. Moving on to noise normalized CFM, cubic feet per minute. So this is where I run the fans down a tube. Mind, my tube is not particularly long, and I try to take the airspeed measurement at the end of the tube, and I know the inner diameter of said tube, so I can calculate the CFM measurement from the airspeed. And right here at the top, we have the Storm T3. It is our top performer, producing 104.7 cubic feet per minute of airflow. The Corsair AF Elite is still towards the top of the graph. They're not quite arranged properly, but it's producing 67 cubic feet per minute of airflow. The Unifan SL140 is producing 81.9 CFM. The Noctua A14 is producing 63.5 CFM of airflow. And again, these are noise normalized values, with my control fan being indicative at the bottom. Moving up to that 100% PWM signal for CFM, we can see that the Storm and the Corsair lose quite a bit of ground, but they're still towards the top in terms of their airspeed. The Storm producing 120 CFM and the Corsair Elite producing 112 CFM. The A14, it's again spinning basically twice as fast as these fans, is producing 195.6 CFM. So almost double for almost double the RPMs. Fans that have a similar RPM are like the NFP14S, and it produces functionally the same airspeed as the Storm T3. Looking at the same sort of data, just from a slightly different perspective. So we have noise on the bottom versus CFM on the vertical. And so this is the way we know how much CFM airflow the fan is producing for a given noise value across the data points that I collect. And the Storm T3 is towards the top of the graphs. It's producing quite a lot of CFM for its airflow, but it lacks the top end airflows that a lot of other fans can produce. But for its given range, it's one of the quieter fans. As for the Corsair Elite, it is towards the top of the graph, but it's more or less in the middle of the roads category. It's doing pretty well, but it's not, I wouldn't call it fantastic. The worst fan in this category is the Arctic P14, sitting right here at the bottom. I just found it to be particularly noisy. Now let's go ahead and jump to the open box experience, and we'll go from there. Before we get into the open box experience, I want to remind you, my viewers, to take a look at my Patreon page and consider joining my Patreon. It's viewers like you that make this testing possible. I've been buying these fans and the test hardware with my own money. I don't have any sponsorships or anything like that, so I really appreciate any and all of you who consider joining my Patreon and helping me out to make all of this possible. And in the future, I would like to get better test hardware and better microphone to make the testing more accurate. So I'd actually go back through all my fans and redo all the sound testing. But anyways, let's get into these fans. So first up in the open box experience, I want to go and talk about the Corsair AF140 Elite. Now this fan does come in an RGB version. I opted to get the plain black version just for sake of testing it. I thought it looked very similar to the Noctua NFA A12X25. Oh, I burped, sorry. Excuse me. In terms of what is on the box, it comes with nothing of note. Anyways, it's got some performance on the bottom. Performance characteristics, high dynamic bearing. So Corsair had a heyday in making excellent PC fans, and I was curious if how their fans were doing nowadays. And I thought this fan looked pretty cool. I really liked the way this rubber grommet dampener looked on the end. Still say it looks cool in person. However, the performance was pretty good, but not quite top tier. So I'm a little bit unimpressed despite the fact of the design. So the frame itself should be good in pressure applications because it's very squared off with very little spaces on it for air to leak out around it. The back struts are very thin and wing-like to help guide the air. However, more struts does give more potential for more noise. Just be warned, so there may be certain circumstances where as the blade travels over these struts, it can produce noise. So it gives more potential for more noise, depending, well, on a bunch of different factors that I'm not quite able to test yet. Is there anything else of note on the screen? The cable on it fits very tightly into one of these struts. I assume that the ARGB one just has an extra cable that tends to run at that exact same spot. That's what I would do, at least from a manufacturing perspective. And it just has a little clip in there to hold everything nice and tight together. On the front, you just have the Corsair logo. And now let's talk about the blades. The blades themselves are very reminiscent, like I said, of the A12X25. They have a small amount of this cupped or spoon type shape, not overly pronounced. They're definitely getting most of the performance from a blade angle, so how steep that angle is going into the back of the frame. Talking about that, so in a pull configuration on my heatsink, I found it to be medium noisy, high pitched in that pull configuration. So I wouldn't say it's great in a pull configuration. However, on a heatsink, it may act slightly differently because there may be a little bit enough of a gap between the blades and the heatsink fins to reduce that sound, basically. The blades themselves are completely smooth. There's no extra grooves or airflow guides on it. And they are pretty thin and flexible. It doesn't take much to get them to move, which could transmit into extra sound in certain applications. And unfortunately, you just have to play that by ear. It's pretty much impossible in testing to test just everything and make it applicable. But there's the overview of my thoughts of this fan. Let's jump to the next one. Alright, the second fan in this testing was the Antec Storm T3 140mm case fan. And it came in a triple pack. Each of the fans was in plastic. And we get a little goodie box that has your extension cables and extra screws and the standoff screws used for radiator heatsinks, or not heatsinks, radiators, because these fans are 30mm thick, so you need extra long screws to mount them. And make sure you don't use those extra long screws on standard thickness fans, otherwise you may have a very bad day and puncture a hole. So just for sake of, you get a little bit of extra thickness there. Alright, so let's finish talking about the box. Standard branding stuff, your performance characteristics. Alright, so as I talked about, I recently reviewed the 120mm version of this fan. I don't know if they'll come up before or after this, but these little joggles, while they look really cool, does give a place for air to escape around the fan, reducing its potential pressure performance. The other aspect for pressure performance is how close these blades get to the edge of the frame, and I would put that in the A category. They get very close. In terms of the frame, it's fairly basic. It's just got a little bit of angle to these struts. The cable is nicely hidden. Matter of fact, this is a much smaller strut than I've seen on most other fans. Just for an example, my NF-A12X25, it is substantially thicker. So having that a smaller strut means that air doesn't have to work as hard to get past this one. So that's overall very good. In terms of how the blades themselves look, this doesn't look to be a pressure optimized blade angle. This looks to be more like an airflow because they are steeper basically. So a shallow blade angle would be flat. A steep blade angle would be coming towards you from this angle. Is going to be the way that I'm going to talk about the orientation. So a simple thought would be using a helicopter blade versus a World War II propeller blade. Helicopter blades are going to be flat to create lots of lift, while a propeller blade on an airplane is going to be angled more like this to propel you forward, to basically fly you through the air. And this looks to be more like that propeller blade. Mine is not 100% there. It's definitely still going to be able to produce some amount of pressure, but I'm just saying what it looks to be optimized for. The tips do get a nice little sharp edge at the front. I can see a little bit of a groove right there. I'm trying to make it catch the light. So that'll help it cut into the air, so to say. But other than that, the blades are completely smooth. They're, I hate to say it, but not really that special. So what's special about this fan is that it's a thicker frame, which helps with pressure applications because it does allow for steeper blade angle for the same depth. So you could have a flatter front and then have the blade arc down into it more steeply, which helps drive the air back. But this blade shape doesn't feel like it's doing that quite as much. It feels more airflow oriented. Mind it does spoon back, cut back. It's got a little bit of that curve to it, but it's not just overly pronounced. And while we're talking about that, in my noise test in a pull configuration, I found it to be medium noisy, high pitched in that pull configuration. I would not use it as a puller, but radiators are different than heat sinks, so it may do just fine in that application. Just as my general kind of caveat. But I guess that's all I have to say about it for right now. Let's jump on to the next section of the video. All right, now that we finished the open box experience, we're going to be taking a look at the value proposition. First up is the price of the fans. The Corsair Elite is a $30 fan. The Storm T3 comes in a pack of 3, making the price of one fan $12. So it is an excellent value because it comes in that pack, and so making the price per fan fairly inexpensive. So that makes it an instant, basically, win for that fan. So going back to what we're taking a look at here, this isn't true performance of the fans. This is performance, so whether it's CFM or meters per second per dollar. So fans that are cheaper but still kind of good will tend to rise to the top, but it isn't the true top raw performance of the fans. So if you need the best and you're willing to pay for it, you can pretty much ignore this section. But if you're on a budget and you're looking for the best bang for the buck you can get, this is where you'd really start taking a look at this data and figuring out which one suits your needs the best. So all of them are based off the pricing of the Elite being that $30 mark, and the 3-pack of the T3, where the price is functionally $12. Now that that's out of the way, we can see that the Storm T3 is basically at the top. It is an excellent value at the 6-inch performance mark, noise normalized. And these are all the 140 millimeter fans, except for this one, which is a 180. And down here we have the 120s. So jumping over to 100% PWM signal, we still see that the T3 is an excellent value, being right at the top. It's not as good as some of the 120s, but if you really want the larger fan, then the T3 might be an excellent choice for you. The Corsair AF Elite is sitting more or less at the middle of the pack. It isn't bad, it isn't great, it's just kind of middle of the road. Moving on to the 9-inch mark, we can again see that the Storm T3 is right at the top, particularly in the 140 millimeter category, both at 100% PWM and noise normalized values. Mind, it is not the best value, but it's definitely up there. And again, 140 millimeter fans on that side. Moving on to CFM. So cubic feet per minute per dollar. Noise normalized, 100% PWM. And the Storm T3 just completely blows every single other fan out of the water with its raw performance capabilities. So I guess we're continuing that same story. It is a excellent value. The Corsair being sitting more or less average. Moving on to CPU cooler performance. So this is in meters per second per dollar again, but it's just through that CPU cooler. The Storm T3 in noise normalized value is once again at the very top of the graphs, just because of that $12 mark for 3 fans. I personally couldn't really locate a single fan. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but if you need to fill your case with fans, then this is an excellent value, or you could get that triple pack and then you've got some spares. Mind, again, these are thicker fans, the Storm T3s, so they may not fit in every part of your case, depending on what type of case you have and how everything is set up. But they are truly excellent value. At 100% PWM, they drop back a little bit because their top-end performance just isn't quite there, but they're still excellent value. The only ones beating it are in the 120 millimeter category. Well, that is the end of this section. Let's jump to the conclusion and wrap this review up. Thank you for watching my video. Please subscribe for more content. I've got lots more fan videos coming up, and I've got a whole bunch more on my channel already. And please check out my Patreon page. It's with viewers like you that makes the channel possible. Thank you and have a great day. And right here is the raw data for the Corsair AF Elite and now the Storm T3. If you wish to use this data for your own purposes, you may do so. However, I ask that you reference me as the person who generated the data because I'm the person who generated it and I worked very hard to collect all this data. Anyways, thank you very much.